Then Simpson had a distant relative through marriage named Emilius. Emilius was also born in Scotland, in the Northern Islands, and at age 14 he was apprenticed to the Royal Navy as a cabin boy, and then he worked himself up through the ranks to become a lieutenant. And so he was there during the Napoleonic Wars, and he was in the Battle of Trafalgar, and those horrendous ship battles, and he had also served around Africa. So he had quite a background. And then when the Napoleonic Wars ended, he was discharged at a very minor pension and was chafing at the bit. So Simpson invited him to join the Hudson Bay Company to become the shipmaster at Fort George on the Pacific Ocean, to take charge of the schooner, the Cadborough, that they had commissioned in England and was sailing around the Horn. So Simpson did that. But on his trip, which also started at York Factory, as a surveyor, he had his surveying instruments, and he had a barometer, a mercury barometer. And so he was taking elevations and bearings and distances, astronomical observations as he went along. And things went well to Fort Edmonton. And then he made the mistake of letting him load his barometer on one of the pack horses on that Muskegee Trail to Fort Assiniboine. And it broke on the way. It was just too grueling a passage. So Simpson had to rely on dead reckoning and he estimated how much elevation they were gaining every day along the river. And by the time he got to Jasper, he was about 6,000 feet out. He was overestimating the amount he'd traveled. So when he got over Athabasca Pass, he estimated that the pass was about 10,000 feet, and that the mountains around were about 6,000 to 7,000 feet above that, giving the Rocky Mountains a height estimated of about 16,000 feet, which of course we know is 6,000 feet too high. So it's interesting that this other guy, Thomas Drummond, who was a botanist also from England, he came out for the Kew Garden, and he lived in the Jasper area. He stayed there a whole year. He just traveled around with one of the Métis guides in there and searched for plants, and wrote a tremendous account of his travels. And then when Emilius Simpson's party came through, he joined them because he wanted to go over the pass with them to explore for plants on the other side of the mountains. So as they traveled together, of course, he would have learned about Simpson's estimates of elevation. And then, so Drummond just went over the pass and came back again on the return trip with horses. Simpson went on to Fort George, and David Douglas was there too. So they talked before Douglas came back over the mountains, and Douglas would have gathered the impression of the pass being about 10,000 feet. So when Douglas came through, he climbed. He was ahead of the party, had good traveling. And so from Athabasca Pass, he said he climbed Mount Brown. He named the mountains Brown and Hooker after two of his fellow botanists in England. And he estimated that Mount Brown was 17,000 feet, given the elevation in there. So here on the maps of the day were these two peaks in the Rocky Mountains, Brown and Hooker, that were, I think, 16,500 and 17,000 feet in elevation. And then the alpining, when that sport of mountain climbing became popular, shortly after, alpinists saw these humongous peaks as high as Everest on the Rocky Mountain chain. And it prompted a lot of exploration among them to find them. And of course, that's another story, but there was no such thing, of course, as I think it was Coleman said that they were he was so chagrined, he called them ordinary mountains. still impressive. Then there was John Edward Harriet, who was also, he was apprenticed, I think, with Hudson Bay Company at age 12, served his apprenticeship in Hudson Bay, and it was at Fort Edmonton. And then he was posted to the New Caledonia, which is in the Prince George area in British Columbia. He married Elizabeth Pruden, who was a daughter of one of the factors at Hudson Bay Company in Fort Edmonton. And they had just had an infant daughter whose name was Margaret. This was over in New Caledonia. So they wanted to come back to Fort Edmonton, and they hitched a ride then with the regular brigades. They got down on the Columbia and came over with them. But his wife, Elizabeth Pruden, was suffering tremendously from depression. And we might conceive that it was probably a postpartum depression, but she was really in a depressed state of mind. And when they camped just on the other side of the mountains, Margaret Rudin went missing one night, and they stayed an extra day looking for her, but there was no trace of her ever found. So it was surmised that she may have fallen into one of these canyons along the Whirlpool River between Cane Meadows and the Scott Glacier. It's rather sad. So here was a group of, there were other families, there were women in the group, and they were able to look after the infant daughter, and they brought her back to Jasper House, and Michel Klein wrote in his journal how astonished they were. He wasn't expecting them to begin with. They were short of food, and here they had this little infant, and what the heck to do? But the women in the group were able to get the infant to Fort Edmonton, where they had cows by that time, and survived, and then she was later moved to Fort Garry, and stayed at the post there, and she grew up. So when she was 17, the daughter, Margaret, came back to Fort Edmonton, and she met John Rowan, who was a son of the Hudson's Bay factor at the time, and got married. And it was at that time Paul Kane was there at the fort on one of his journeys, and he wrote this, he painted this picture, this image of the honeymooners of the wedding that he attended. And it turned out that this was Margaret Harriet and John Rowan in his painting, and they were off honeymooning to Fort Pitt by dog team, 320 kilometers. What a honeymoon journey. That would have been astonishing to see they're love to keep them warm. And then a couple of others, Fathers Blanchette and DeMars, were noted Catholic priests from Quebec. And by this time, there had been such a French influence develop at Fort Vancouver by this time, at the end of the trail down and along the Columbia. There was such a French Catholic community had developed in there as a result of the fur trade that they implored the church to send a priest to minister to them. And Fathers Blanchette and DeMars volunteered. They were both from Quebec. They traveled all that way by canoe and came with their brigade from York Factory on through Jasper. So from Jasper, or from Fort Edmonton, there was a party of over 60 men, women, and children. This was probably the largest group that came over the pass in there. They baptized people, Métis, and along the way, and held the first church service up at Athabasca Pass, and then got down to boat encampment and found that the boats to take them downriver were inadequate to take them all at once. There were just so many. This was a humongously large party. And so they made two trips. They took the boats down to the first camping area, and Fathers Blanchette and DeMars were in that first group that went down. And when they came back for the second group, the boats were really overloaded, and one of them capsized on the Aldemet on the Columbia River. That's around where the Athabasca Dam is built now, and 14 drowned in that one. It was a rather tragic episode at that point. So it was not an easy journey there at all. Then finally, Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, whose name is quite familiar. He was a Roman Catholic priest who served the Northwest in the United States. His parish was in Idaho. He'd been in Montana. And he was a very adventurous guy, very self-effacing. His diary is really interesting to read, his journal. Self-effacing fellow, but very effective. But his mission was, because of the warring between the Blackfoot and the Cree, that he was trying to he made a journey through one of the southern passes, I think it was Simpson Pass. He came over up to Fort Edmonton, trying to find representatives of these tribes so he could try to negotiate peace between them. And he wasn't successful. He didn't find what he was looking for. So when he was at Fort Edmonton, he said, in essence, what the heck, I might as well go home by way of the Athabasca Pass and see some more of the country. And Roland, who was in charge at that time, said, no way, you're much too overweight. You'd never make it. So de Smet in his journal said that he fasted for 30 days and got out there on his own, baptizing people on the way as well. That's another story that I don't want to digress on, but he's very well received. And in fact, the people at Jasper House named a mountain after him. There's a Roche de Smet there now. So he headed out over Athabasca Pass, and on his way he met these two fellows, Vavasour and War, who were British spies who had gone out to Fort Vancouver to scout the ground to see how defensible Fort Vancouver was against a possible American attack. This is during the War of 1812, and shortly after there was just turmoil about territorial dispute. And he met these guys who he'd met before at his own home mission. So the sketch made of him in there. And they didn't realize at the time that the Oregon Treaty of 1845 had already been signed and the boundary line had been developed in there as it now stands. But the boundary running through on the 49th parallel was an artifact of the fact that the British had established a presence there as well.